Hey historians, it's Mrs. Tyler. Today we're going to do Unit 4 Notes for Becoming a World Power. Page 11 in our notes packet. So, here we are. 1867, shortly after the Civil War had ended, Secretary of State William Seward was given the opportunity to purchase Alaska from Russia for 2 cents an acre. Most Americans thought that this region was a worthless Arctic wasteland, and they really made fun of William Seward for going through with the deal anyway. They nicknamed the deal Seward's Folly. There's William Seward. There's Alaska. Okay. And here's a political cartoon of President Andrew Johnson and William Seward and their treaty with Russia to buy this big hunk of ice. Okay. So in your notes, fill in U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. But we also know that Alaska is way more than just a big, massive hunk of ice. This is also Alaska, and it's beautiful. It's not always covered in snow and ice. The Arctic wasteland turned out to be a treasure filled with forests, plentiful fish, diverse wildlife. It was not the permanently frozen Arctic that Seward's critics assumed it was. Settlers found great mineral wealth, including coal, copper, and even gold. We have the Klondike gold rush in that era. The success of this expansionist deal inspired Americans to look at other parts of the world and wonder, what other territories could we access that will provide for our economy? Seward's deal also secured American rights to a couple of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that we call the Midway Islands. And we don't give a whole lot of thought to them until we are wrapped up in World War II in the 1940s, and those Midway Islands become really, really important to us. But this brings us to look at something that's going on, as something that all the cool countries are doing, called imperialism. Okay, during the election of 1896 between William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, many other countries are expanding their power and their influence by establishing colonies in other parts of the world. And there are going to be some Americans who really think that we should be doing that too. Okay. Many Americans, though, like William Jennings Bryan, felt that the United States should not participate in imperialism. Some felt that it would go against the very values that made us a country, the idea of consent to the governed. We had been colonies of another country, and we won and fought for our independence from Britain. And so some Americans were like, well, that would be really hypocritical of us to participate in imperialism when we didn't like being a colony of someone else. However, McKinley won this election. He had a lot of campaign funding and help from big businessmen to expand America's influence, because if we get involved in imperialism, it would provide us with business opportunities, more economic opportunities around the world, more natural resources to tap into, new markets where we can sell our products. So businessmen who had a lot of money and invested in McKinley's presidential campaign really pushed for McKinley to go the imperialism route. In our notes on page 11, we're going to highlight these clues to understand the definition of imperialism: expanding a country's power by gaining political and economic control over other countries and establishing colonies in other parts of the world. When I hear imperialism, I think of Star Wars and the Imperial fleet, and how the empire is expanding across the galaxy, little planet by little planet. And if they don't cooperate, they blow those planets up, right? Well, we're not blowing up planets, but we are kind of getting wrapped up in this world trend of spreading our power and influence to other parts of the world. So one of the places that Americans look to next is there in Hawaii. Americans began to establish economic interests in the Pacific Ocean. Expansionists developed interest in the Hawaiian Islands. Americans had first come to Hawaii as missionaries to convert native Hawaiians to Christianity. In 1835, a merchant from Boston started a sugar plantation in Hawaii, and not long after, many other American settlers started to arrive to establish sugar and pineapple plantations all over the islands. They were brought in workers from China and Japan to work their fields. The Americans pressured Hawaiians to allow the U.S. to build a naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in 1887, and we do. That may sound familiar to you. American planters in Hawaii convinced Congress to allow their sugar to be imported into the U.S. without extra taxes. This frustrated the sugar growers in the U.S. because it created more competition for our domestic sugar grown here in the U.S. When Congress approved giving a bonus to the domestic sugar growers, then the Hawaiian planters are jealous and they want the bonus too. They began to petition to make the U.S. a part, or to make Hawaii a part of the U.S. so that they could get the deal on the domestic sugar bonus as well. American planters organized a revolt to remove Hawaii's native monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, with help from the U.S. Marines. President Grover Cleveland had felt that Hawaii should be governed by Hawaiians, but in 1898, when President McKinley had taken office, the United States is definitely looking into more expansionism and imperialism, and this president does decide to annex Hawaii. So there's her crown. Hawaii was annexed in 1898, and Queen Liliuokalani is sad by that. Okay. American sugar planters and growers were also establishing plantations in the Caribbean. Expansionists wanted to annex both Cuba and Puerto Rico, but they were both colonies of Spain at the time. Well, thinking way back, many presidents ago, we had issued the Monroe Doctrine, specifically because Spain was trying to flex its muscles in the Western Hemisphere. So we basically said, hey, you know what, Europe, you should probably stick to your side of the planet. You need to stop creating more colonies, and, you know, on this side of the planet, we got things covered over here. So many Americans were feeling that the United States needed to enforce the Monroe Doctrine that told European empires to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Cubans had tried to revolt 30 years earlier. They wanted to win their independence from Spain, but they failed, and Spain put down their revolution, and they put Cuban men, women, and children in prison camps where they were forced to live without adequate food and care, and tens of thousands of Cubans died. That brings us to how we report the news here in the United States. American newspapers are quick to profit off of the plight of the Cubans. Competing newspaper companies often stretch the truth and sensationalize stories of Spain's treatments of the Cubans. Okay, extra, extra, Spain feeds Cuban prisoners to sharks. Read all about it. One American newspaper stated a Spanish general was feeding the Cubans to sharks. This kind of exaggerated and misleading publication is called yellow journalism. We have similar things happen today. We call those headlines, those sensationalized headlines, clickbait to get people to click on the article. Some people don't ever actually click the article to read it. They just go by what the sensationalist headline says, and then we end up ingesting a whole lot of what we call fake news. But back at the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, we called it yellow journalism. This sensationalism helped sell newspapers and also stirred up sympathy for Cuba. Some people were starting to call for a war with Spain. So please highlight the definition, some clues to the definition of yellow journalism: publishing sensational and exaggerated stories in newspapers in order to attract readers and impact people's opinions. Okay? To protect Americans that were living in Cuba, President McKinley sent a brand new battleship called the USS Maine to Havana, the capital of Cuba. Kind of a reminder that, hey, Spain, we're watching. 3 weeks after the Maine arrived, it mysteriously exploded. 260 sailors died. Nobody knew what had led to the explosion. Most Americans, of course, are quick to blame Spain. McKinley hoped to avoid war and tried working out a solution between Cuba and Spain, but Spain didn't respond. Fueled by outcry from the American press and Americans calling out to remember the Maine, Congress declared war on Spain in April of 1898. Americans are eager to participate in this war to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule. The U.S. Army grows from only being 30,000 to over 274,000 men. Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy is a man named Theodore Roosevelt. He resigns. He quits being the Secretary of the Navy to form his own kind of what you would call like special forces, elite soldier group that was a cavalry group known as the Rough Riders. Okay. Roosevelt's Rough Riders, along with 17,000 other troops, arrived in Cuba in June of 1898. Roosevelt and his men were able to capture the major city of Santiago after taking San Juan Hill. Here's Roosevelt right here, and these are the Rough Riders. Once Americans had taken Santiago, the Spanish tried to retreat by racing their ships out of the harbor, but the U.S. captured or sank every single Spanish ship. The Spanish-American War lasted 4 months. Secretary of State John Haig called it a splendid little war. The peace treaty with Spain established Cuba as an independent nation. The United States gained Puerto Rico as a territory, along with Guam, which is an island in the Pacific Ocean. Only 345 Americans died in combat fighting the Spanish-American War. However, 5,000 American soldiers die of tropical diseases because of fighting in a tropical area. In 1903, the treaty with Cuba was signed so that the U.S. could lease some land, and we built a naval base in Cuba at Guantanamo Bay. So in your notes, please fill in the information in the blanks for the Spanish-American War. Americans owned sugar plantations in Cuba. Spain controlled both islands. Contrary to the Monroe Doctrine, U.S. fought the Spanish-American War to give Cuba its independence. On page 2 in your notes packet, we have the Unit 4 timeline. Please add Spanish-American War to 1898. On the other side of the globe, the Philippines were also under Spanish rule, and before Congress had declared war with Spain, Theodore Roosevelt, before he stepped down from being Secretary of the Navy, sent a telegram to U.S. Admiral George Dewey, who was on a ship in the Pacific Ocean, ordering him that as soon as the United States declared war with Spain, that he was to go in and attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. The Filipinos had been trying to gain independence from Spanish rule for a long time. They had been led by this gentleman, which is General Emilio Aguinaldo. Filipinos attacked the Spanish army and the government officials. 5 days after the U.S. declared war with Spain, Admiral Dewey's fleet arrived in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Spain's old wooden warships are no match for America's new modern steel ships and our well-trained Navy. So Admiral Dewey is able to blockade the port at Manila. The Filipinos believed the United States Navy was there to help them gain independence. So when Spain surrendered to the Americans, the United States negotiated and bought the Philippines from Spain in the peace treaty. Congress voted to annex the Philippines, and it was a useful location for American businesses and our military in the Pacific Ocean. But this didn't go over very well with the Filipinos. They felt like we had lied to them, that we misled them. They thought we were there to help them gain independence, but really we were there kind of for our own benefit. They end up resisting American occupation for quite a while, and the U.S. eventually will give the Philippines their independence in 1946, which will be after World War II. Theodore Roosevelt, President McKinley is reelected in 1900, and at this time, Theodore Roosevelt was chosen to be his vice president. Americans considered Roosevelt to be a war hero with his success in the Rough Riders. September of 1901, President McKinley is shot and killed by a socialist immigrant who claimed that the president was a leader of a corrupt government that was the enemy of the hardworking people. So that means Theodore Roosevelt takes office. He's sworn in as president in September 1901. He became known as the Progressive President. He enforces the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies. He passes the Pure Food and Drug Act to protect consumers, and he helps expand the number of national parks to protect the environment. Roosevelt also thinks that we have a need for a canal that will link the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean so our Navy can get from one ocean to the other without having to go all the way around South America. So he gets Congress to approve funding to build this canal. The biggest problem, though, here's what we call the isthmus. This is North America. This is South America. This is where we want to build this canal because it's the narrowest spot between the two oceans there. But it's owned by Colombia. Colombia doesn't want to sell it to us. So Roosevelt's not going to let that stop him. He sends a warship to Panama, encourages the people of Panama to win their independence from Colombia. So we basically start a war with Colombia. Panama wins because they have help from the U.S. Navy. And as a thank you, this is an example of Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Our big stick to keep other countries from messing with us is our powerful military. So the U.S., as a thank you, gets to build the Panama Canal through Panama. It's 51 miles. Construction was difficult, and workers often caught malaria and other illnesses, but ultimately we have the shortcut built. Later on, we apologize to Colombia, and we ultimately give the people of Panama power over the Panama Canal. So there you go. There's imperialism and how the United States grew in imperialism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Thanks for listening.